our World History online edition. Right? We're going to be talking about two sort of conflicting styles of government, particularly here in the 1600s. We're going to be dealing with absolutism and then kind of non-absolutism, examples of both. We're going to set the stage here for talking about how religion kind of plays into both of these, the formation of both of these styles of government, and so we're going to be dealing with that in the 30 Years' War, talk about changes in terms of world military, but then we're going to be dealing with the absolutism of France, and then the sort of non-absolutism or anti-absolutism of the English Civil War and of the English example during this time period. All right, well, if the 14th and the 15th centuries were a time of relative peace and calm, not always, right? It does get totally shattered here by the time you get to the 17th century, right? Wars and revolts all throughout the European continent, and thus sort of radiating outward to much of the rest of the world, are going to be coupled to a number of economic failures. Normally we associate sort of wars with political or dynastic or maybe religious reasons, but we also have to understand the role that economics plays in kind of tearing apart these old alliances. Ever-increasing amount of trade with the Americas had created a number of problems. While it's great for the Spanish that discovered these sort of mountains of gold and silver in the New World and begin importing that into the European continent, over the course of time, this is going to create a great deal of inflation by the time you get to the 16th century. And then in the 17th century, these economies begin to seriously slide along with the rest of the population because not a lot of people invest in physical asset and capital gains, but in fact just, we're going to get money in and we're going to buy it. So in fact, the people that have it the worst are the ones getting the money the easiest, particularly the Iberian countries of Spain and Portugal. People are also, when we talk about one of the main problems, overarching problems of the 17th century, is a great deal of uncertainty. Uncertainty about politics, uncertainty about religion, uncertainty about the economy, uncertainty about society, and where these were going to go as you get into later periods. Now, a good example of this is the witch hunt craze of the 1600s. Many of us here in America are kind of familiar with the Salem witchcraft trials and things like that of the late 1600s. But earlier, about 50 years or more earlier in the 1600s in Europe, you had a number of these. And typically what you're going to see is the reason that it's indicative, and I know it's a lot of fun when they make movies about this, or you read stories as, you got crazy witches and they're spouting off like devil speak in court and whether or not they can turn people into newts. That's all fun, but the reality is, generally speaking, what you're seeing is, in many ways, it's part of a social problem that as people are dealing with changing societal realities, in many cases, who gets the finger pointed at them? Well, overwhelmingly, it's women, particularly women that are beginning to engage in a bunch of, in a newfound social agency. Women that were shopkeeper owners or other business owners active in this kind of activities, often the ones that had the finger pointed at them as well. Now, whether or not there's a certain amount of also mental instability, if there's an actual physical problem with the human brain, that may be as well. But overwhelmingly, this is what you're going to see as a function of what's going on with this witchcraft case. So they put them on trial, whether or not they're actual witches, and then they also, another fun one is to torture them into confessing that they're witches, and so you can see them being hung with the soles of their feet sort of burned. Mass hanging is also a pretty popular way to deal with them. But of course, the tried and true method is the burning alive, right? The human barbecue approach to dealing with witches, right? You have a little bit of the rumbling that we had talked about of these religious wars in the 1500s. You have the Peasants' Revolt that takes place here in Germany, and you have some other little religious wars that have kind of gone back and forth. But in reality, these apparently are just the pre-shocks. Right? These are just the previews for the much larger conflict, which is going to rope in most of Europe and is going to completely enmesh religion and politics. In fact, at that point, we wouldn't even say that religion and politics are coming together because religion and politics were already together. They were essentially synonymous. Your religion and your politics were the same. It's only later centuries that people begin to actually separate the two. Right? What you're going to see here is this is going to start at the epicenter of several crossroads where you've got a political empire held by a loosely confederated emperor against local princes, some of which are Catholic, some of which are Protestant. You're going to have the multinationalism of the empire where most of it's German. A big chunk of it is, in this case, Bohemian, Czech, Ruthenian, Romanian, Hungarian, Italian. And then you're going to have also the outside forces of places like Sweden and France that are going to get involved with this as well. So what you're going to have is a revolt by a number of Bohemian princes. They don't like being ruled by a German. They're what we would refer to as the Czechs today. And they revolt against these princes of the Habsburg monarchy, the Habsburg Empire. Okay, right? Well, they're also Protestant, and the Habsburg Emperor, Ferdinand, is a Catholic. So what's going to happen is, while he has this direct rebellion against his personal rule across the mountains in Bohemia, he then puts on his other hat as the emperor and calls in all the resources of the Holy Roman Empire. So he wants to pull in now all of these, particularly these German princes, to send troops to deal with this area in the south. Now, what pulls this in is, in part, the religious side of this. Many of these German princes are Catholic. They want to see these non-Catholic guys finally get their comeuppance after 100 and more years of Protestantism. And so they're very quickly going to go on this sort of conquering spree. Bohemia, Holland, West Germany, the German Baltic ports, all the Protestant forces are in retreat. And Ferdinand is very much at the height of his power, right? Which greatly alarmed a lot of the German princes, many of which, of course, if they were Protestant, but also, as we're going to see, they just didn't like the thought of the Holy Roman Emperor all of a sudden being an actual, real autocrat, where he could tell them what to do like an actual monarch, rather than just kind of this shadowy, sort of substanceless figurehead monarch that they really wanted. By 1629, he's at the height of his power after 11 years of fighting, and Protestantism is made illegal in the empire. And so you can see part of the confusion and map here of what's going on. This is the Holy Roman Empire, is the red line. And then the green, dominant Catholic areas, and then the yellow is going to be dominant Lutheran areas, and then the purple is Calvinist. So essentially the yellow and the purple, they go together. And then the green are these Catholic areas. And so you can see this very confusing state of affairs in Central Europe. When you break it down in terms of nationality, it gets even more confusing, and we won't have to go through all of this, but it gives you an idea of why this becomes such a confusing mess. And I love this little bit of artwork about Ferdinand. He is at the height of his power here in 1629. He has trampled over these forces of the Protestants below him. But in the background, even though he's the conqueror, you have these storm clouds. And I like to think that maybe the artist knew what he was doing. I'm not exactly sure where the art comes from. But it gives you an idea of kind of where this is going to go, because this isn't the end. It's a 30 years war. It's going to go 1618 all the way to 1648. The intervention is actually going to come from the Baltic states. All right, it's going to come from Scandinavia, and that's going to be the Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus. This is the point in world history where Sweden is a world power. It's really the only time that Sweden's a world power. Sorry, Sweden. But Gustavus Adolphus is extremely Protestant, and he dislikes what he is seeing across the Baltic going on in Germany, and he arrives with an army to fight on behalf of the Protestants. Gustavus Adolphus is one of these great war-fighting kings. He can not only set public policy as the monarch, but also he is going to be able to have the military skill to take the field personally, and he is going to help clear out pretty much all of northern Germany. But southern Germany is going to remain in Catholic hands because Adolphus is killed in battle. Unfortunate for Adolphus. The Swedish army is then going to pull out, and you have a very destabilized situation where neither side now has been able to claim victory. And at this point, the French are going to directly intervene from the outside. You would think that this is a very clear-cut scenario, right? The Holy Roman Emperorship is Catholic in Catholic hands. The French are Catholic. And so if this is just that straight-up religious war that you kind of like to think of it as, we got Catholics on one side and Protestants on the other, well, the French are going to come in on the side of the Catholics. No. The French come in on France's side, right? They drive these Spanish forces back into the Netherlands, and they're also going to defeat the imperial forces in southern Germany. France is seeing the Germans kind of going at each other and tearing each other apart, and then right towards the end is when they're going to get involved to take advantage of this weakness. Well, by 1648, all the sides are ready to call it quits, and they get together at Westphalia, and they're going to sign a peace treaty, the Peace of Westphalia. Now, this is what's going to end the conflict. Basically, what they come up with is, all right, we got to guarantee religious freedom in Germany. Let's not fight over religion again. France is also going to find itself catapulted to the #1 seat in Europe. Germany is completely devastated. The Holy Roman Empire was almost wholly given over to local power because of all of the degrading factors that had taken power away from the Holy Roman Emperor in the latter days of the war, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 25% of the German population is dead. This is ridiculously horrendous. So there's Gustavus Adolphus, there's his army. They're praying to God right before they go into battle as they are going to meet these Catholic forces on the continent of Europe. There you can see his funeral beer as he has been slain in battle and he's being brought back to Sweden for burial. This is a great scene from the 30 Years' War. What do you do when you've got an enemy in a fortified town? Well, you set your cannons up on a hill and you start blasting it, and you just start blasting it, and whoever you kill in there, it's okay because they're the other side, right? They're Catholic and you're Protestant, or they're Protestant and you're Catholic. Either way, they're the devil's minions, so it's all right to slaughter all of them. Now, of course, a lot of these people would try to flee in the onset of advancing armies before they get there. This is one of these columns of refugees as they're heading out of this town in the background, and they have been waylaid by one of these marauding armies. And of course, they're going in and they're slaughtering the civilians, because this isn't totally a political war. Well, it is a political war, but we're going to see that religion and politics are wrapped up together, and so you don't want these guys to get away. They're bad guys. You want to catch them and you want to kill them because they're, you know, Satan's minions. So this is a problem with a religious coloring to warfare. And so they said that the trees of Germany were insufficient to hang all the people. You would find the trees full of hanged people at this point here, whichever side. If the Catholics come into a Protestant town, if the Protestants come into a Catholic town, there was a lot of really, really ugly stuff going on, no matter which side you wanted to look at. Now, as we've talked about throughout the course of the semester, right, one of the functions of societal power is how does this relate to life on the battlefield? And normally, it might be tempting for a lot of us to just kind of write off the battlefield as, well, what happens in warfare, it just kind of happens. It's a product of the state that makes it, and if you don't like military history, you can kind of forget it. But in fact, we're going to see that what happens on the battlefield directly influences the political realities of the society that sends these armies out. One of the social underpins of the European noble power was the nobility. We were the main warriors. We should have social power. Why? Because the defense of the state rests on our shoulders, right? We're the knights. We're the ones that have the big retinue of soldiers that we can bring to the battlefield. However, this changing military reality meant, and we see it shift throughout much of world history, and this is another one of these shifts as we see by the 1600s, armies ever increasingly were made up of foot soldiers. These were these guys firing ever increasingly musket-type weapons, firelocks, arquebuses, those kind of things. And they were also becoming more and more professional soldiers. These technological changes are really, really going to affect this because you're going to have first the pike holding back the heavy horse charge, and then of course cannons and muskets in the hands of what had been relatively uneducated peasants and relatively poor people. And they're the ones that are deciding which way the battle is going to go, not so much the charge now of the knight. The knight, as the horseback warrior, he's the one that determines who has victory. In fact, ever increasingly, it's the infantry that are being able to engage these guys thanks to the firearm. And of course, if the previous missile weapons, the crossbow, the longbow, things like that, you've got to practice that almost for a lifetime. I mean, really for years to be actually pretty good at it. A musket, on the other hand, within a few hours, given the fact that they're not super accurate, you're going to be about as good as it is good at firing it as you're ever going to get, and you can be really, really effective. You can blow some guy off a horse with a musket at 50 yards or so within a relatively short amount of time. So since knights can no longer dominate the battlefield, questions about their place in society are going to arise. And of course, ever increasingly, they only attack when the enemy infantry ranks are broken by either rifle or musket or cannon fire. And so you can see some of these early examples where you kind of have a cross between the musketeer of later centuries and the medieval knight of previous centuries in this one. Here you can see some Spanish musketeers. Here you can see some English firelock men with their pikemen to the front. And so this is some of this military revolution that's taking place. Here you can see some of these guys are firing a volley in unison with their pikemen kind of in the background. Not super huge cannons of the 17th century, but they're beginning to make their presence felt ever increasingly on the battlefield. So one of the main topics that we're going to talk about here, and if you go on and you take World History 2, this is going to be one of the first things to talk about is this idea of absolutism. Should monarchies have absolute power or not? We've got a couple of examples. One showing it going in one direction, and one kind of showing it going in the other direction. So the one to talk about absolutism and the growth of the best example of this, of course, is France. And this idea of the absolute power of the monarchy reaches its zenith under France's Louis XIV. Now, I want to say, at a time, it's not my fault that France can't think of a name other than Louis to name its kings, forcing undergrads to have to memorize these guys by Roman numerals, and that's it. Not my fault. Not my idea. Don't shoot the messenger. So anyway, So if you have to, get flashcards and just number them 14, 15, 16. This is especially a problem for World History 2 students, right? Now, Louis's father had been, of course, Louis. Louis had relied especially on prelates of the Catholic Church, particularly Cardinal Richelieu. I know it seems odd for us to talk about church people running parts of the government. For these guys, that's how it went, right? Cardinal Richelieu had done a really good job of helping to centralize France. And to do this, he had used what you and I might refer to as the secret police. He spied particularly on the nobles, and he plotted for autonomy for the central government, and in many cases he had them eliminated, right? He increased the central tax power because the ability to have money and to spend money, right, is the ability to have power over what people do. And he wanted to send out these legates to execute the monarchy's will on the local level. See, it's local power that constantly is fighting national power. Well, Louis XIII's administration really laid a lot of the groundwork for having absolute power of himself, but then he's going to die, right? Louis, number 13, is going to join the choir invisible, and then that means his throne is going to pass to his son Louis the 14th. Again, not my fault, right? So Louis XIV is going to take over what was already a government that is verging towards high amount of centralization, right? And despite the fact he's only 4 when he ascends the throne, he wanted to rule really fully and completely by the time of his ascension to power, because they don't let 4-year-olds run the government. So here's Louis XIV, right? You get big hair, you get all this kind of stuff. This gives you an idea of kind of how wealthy, how powerful this guy's was seen. And it gives you a good idea too, ladies, in case you're interested in this kind of thing. This is back when a guy could be sexy with long permed hair, flowing sequin robes, pantyhose, and pumps. Good looking. This is him portrayed as the great medieval knight, I suppose, right? He's got the sceptered rod of the Roman emperor. He's got the medieval armor. He's got this wicked cool helmet. He's even got boots that go up to his knees. And then the poof, I can't explain all this kind of stuff. It gets really silly here, where he's dressed as a full-on Roman emperor. He's got the sandals and the angel of God coming down to put the laurel wreath on his head. Okay, I've reached the point where I can't even explain this to you guys anymore. This has stopped making sense. All right, Louis XIV, he really comes to dominate this central policy-making machinery of the state. One of the things that you've got to do if you want central power is to marginalize or eliminate the local power, the local nobility, but he also wants to make sure that the Catholic Church operating inside of France is pushed to the edges as well. He dominates foreign policy, and he actually is very interested in fighting a number of wars to try to expand France's holdings in Europe. He has a limited amount of success. His sensibility on this one is to try to get France to where its natural borders should be, basically defensible borders, which means the Pyrenees Mountains in the southwest, which he will achieve, and the Rhine River in the east, which he will not achieve. And so, like I said, there are a number of wars that he's going to engage in with kind of a mixed bag for success. Louis was also interested, though, in stimulating the economy, but not for the reasons that those of us who are kind of libertarian Americans would like, which is, it's our money, it's our freedom, we want a great economy so that way you can do whatever it is that you want to do. He saw this as an avenue to increase the tax base, right? With people making more money, with people making more product, then that is more taxable sort of goods that he can send into the central coffers in order to have a more vigorous foreign policy and a more vigorous domestic policy. Because he was very controlling of taxes and tariffs. Now, he did build a lot of infrastructure, like roads and canals, but again, this was to pump up the economy in order to pump up the tax base. So he has an angle on where he's going with this. Now, Louis did run into trouble at the local level because he's not going to totally be able to eradicate local power. The local officials are going to resist a lot of central control. And we're going to see that Louis' France really, though, becomes the model for absolutism for all the European powers, with a lot of European officials and diplomats and things like that coming to his social and political capital built at Versailles in order to kind of get an idea of this. And Versailles itself is a great example of how you gain power from local nobles, and that you bring them there, engage them in all these social events, and it keeps them kind of busy, and you're sort of buying their power and their influence by giving them social access to you as the monarch, and of course, you have this fantastic estate. So here this is, you can see from a sort of 3/4 bird's eye view, this is what it would look like when you pull up to the main front doors. This over here, this is the servants' quarters, right? I know it's really, really fancy, but in the background, that's what you have with the servants' quarters. The inside of Versailles is no less ornate and resplendent with tapestries, vaulted ceilings, inlaid floors, teak, wood, gold, paintings, whole 9 yards, right? With this. This is the Hall of Mirrors, one of the great sort of places, one of the great spots in all of Europe. Not only is this impressive for Versailles and Louis XIV's government, it's going to be important when we talk about the end of World War I, World War II. It's going to be one of the great spots where a lot of important social events happen. You've got these fountains with these gold statues that are shooting water everywhere, sort of the Disney World of this period. Now, if you want to use England as our counterexample, we've got to understand sort of what's going on with these guys. The Tudor dynasty is going to die out in 1603. Sorry, right? Elizabeth fails to crank out an heir, right? And this is going to give way to the Stuart family. Now, the Stuarts are from Scotland, and they were leaning towards Catholicism. And as we've seen in English history, once Henry VIII kind of makes that break, both politically and to a lesser extent religiously with the Catholic Church, England, for the most part, is kind of happy to leave the Roman Catholic Church behind. Now, one of the growing Protestant movements inside of England at this point are the Puritans. Those of us in American history, oh, the Puritans, yeah, they're the buckle hat guys, and Happy Thanksgiving, and all that kind of stuff. Yes, but they are also a big political movement inside of England. And the Puritans have a number of politically powerful and important people, and they're pretty wary of Charles's slipping towards Catholicism, right? Parliament at this point is trying to assert its own authority and try to impose more control, and they're trying to say, the king just doesn't have total absolute power until eventually Charles has had enough of all of their meddling in religious and political and economic affairs, and he has several prominent members of Parliament arrested. Well, this is then going to spark a massive backlash, which is going to erupt into open civil war. You'll have the parliamentarian faction, which is going to be led by Oliver Cromwell, one of the great generals that England is going to produce. And they're going to wind up fighting this civil war. Long story short, is they're going to capture Charles. They're going to capture the king after one of these battles. But then they have this internal debate about what to do with him, what kind of religion is England going to have now that we've captured Charles, and there's a lot of stupidity that happens. Anyway, they wind up letting Charles go. He escapes. He gets away from them. And then he goes to Scotland. He tries to raise another army out of his Scottish relatives. They fight another series of battles that take place. There's a series of engagements. And they capture Charles again. This time they're going to make sure that he doesn't get away because they do the one thing you can't undo to a king, and that's they cut his head off. That's the funny thing about kings. You can't un-execute them. Now, for those of you who have ever sat around a lot thinking, what does it look like when you kill an English king? Well, there's several artistic pictorials of this. There's Charles. He's been strapped to the floor with his neck on the block with the axe raised over his head. And then as you can see from this one, there's Charles's body. There's Charles's head with a disturbing amount of distance between the two. Well, okay, we got rid of the king. We don't have a monarch anymore. What are we going to do? In fact, a lot of the English, especially the parliamentarian faction, they had really banked on the idea that they were becoming anti-monarchical just out of course. And so Cromwell kind of takes over the leader. And he has Parliament, they get together, they abolish the monarchy, but you've got to have somebody, they realize that somebody's got to do the executive branch of government. I mean, somebody's got to govern, right? And so they don't name him king because they've gotten rid of the idea of a king, at least they did. And they call him the Lord Protector. I guess that's pretty cool. I guess it's not a king. But Parliament is feeling its own oats. I mean, it was their army, it was their ideas that had done a civil war against King Charles, and so they begin to push for these ideas of more, not what you and I would call democracy, but more democracy, more equality. Parliament wanted to have more say over the budget, and Cromwell soon finds out the downside of being a constitutional, or at least a limited, executive, and that is you don't just get everything you want. Okay? No matter what your previous ideas of government were, Thomas Jefferson went through this same thing, oh, presidents are bad, oh, executive power's bad, until I'm the president, in which case everything is fine and okay, right? Cromwell goes through this same evolution, where he finds it pretty hard to work with Parliament. Parliament wants its own prerogatives, and eventually Cromwell just throws his hands up and says, you guys are an enemy to what I'm trying to do, and he dissolves the body. He just dissolves Parliament, and he rules England essentially as a dictator for about 3 years. Then he dies. Great. We don't have a monarchy. So, I mean, if you had a monarchy, then Cromwell's kid, or Cromwell's brother's kid, or Cromwell's cousin, or Cromwell's, I don't know, somebody would take over in his family, right? But they don't have this. This is Lord Protector. And so the army was kind of left in charge, but the English army was like, we don't want to be in charge of this. How do you do this? And so they declined to continue this series of military dictators, and they decided to reestablish the monarchy under Charles II. with a series of admonitions. Hey, you don't want to wind up like your dad. Right? So that's what's going to take place here. This is Cromwell. He's being named Lord Protector. I love the look on his face. Oh, me. Yo, you want me? The guy who has all the guns. Anyway. But that's how this worked itself out. Also, if you're Irish, you're probably boiling with hatred at my continual mention of Cromwell's name, because he also started the English invasion of Ireland. And this is, you can see him leading the bombardment of one of these Irish cities. And this is going to lead to why Northern Ireland is one thing, and most of the rest of Ireland is something else with this. Charles II, he mostly behaved himself, but he really had to listen to what kind of Parliament was doing. And of course, Parliament is pretty happy to have free reign to do whatever it is that they want to do for the most part, right? Charles II produced James II, and James II had a problem, and that was he was a Catholic. See, in those days, you were held to be whatever religion your mother was. But it was cool. They were willing to put up with the Catholic monarch for a little while, because James II, he was kind of an old guy, right? And he had only had daughters. The daughters were Protestant. So cool. It's cool. We'll let James sit on the throne. He'll get old. He'll drop dead. And one of his daughters will wind up being the queen. Protestant will be back to having Protestant. But then all of a sudden he produces a male heir who's a Catholic. Yeah, great. Okay? So now all of a sudden, right, the English are looking at, we're not going to have just like one aberrant, brief Catholic king. We're looking at possibly a Catholic dynasty. What if this Catholic kid marries a Catholic princess, and then we have more Catholic grandkids, and right? So these English nobles, they invite James's daughter, who had married a Dutch nobleman named William, in order to, they basically tell him, like, listen, you need to invade England, and we will help you, right? Now, I have invade in quotes because this was a setup right from the start, right? When their invasion fleet arrives, they take over and they win with almost no fighting whatsoever. William of Orange thus becomes the king, but Parliament reads in the Riot Act and they let him know that this is now a constitutional monarchy and not just do whatever you feel like kind of thing. So there he is being receiving the Declaration of Rights, and that's what's going to happen with this. So when you look at the 17th century, Europe is really in, Central Europe is in pretty bad straits. It's had itself prostrated from the 30 Years' War. Religion and monarchy had put together a recipe of chaos, death, and not peace and order. So you've got these problems there. Europe does dominate most of the world, but by force, right? Absolutism in France, you've got the kings of that part, especially of continental Europe, growing ever increasingly powerful. The idea of national monarchy is growing. England had developed a constitutional monarchy, but had to endure a civil war in order to reach that point. So the individual, which is going to become really much more important as we get into world history too, is beginning to emerge as a factor in Western thought. And so I'll end it here with this idea that that these people in the 1600s, they didn't know what was going to happen, and they're just going to have to sort of wait and see what happens next.